Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I have been asked by a longtime viewer and an individual whom I greatly respect to comment on the merits and on some of the weaknesses of the philosophy of objectivism. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, objectivism is the philosophy that was founded by Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand was a Russian-American novelist and philosopher who lived from 1905 to 1982. Really a brilliant person, a very keen, logical, analytical mind who has had an immense influence on American thinking, including in philosophy, politics, and even economics, as she helped popularize the works of such great Austrian economists as Ludwig von Mises. Ayn Rand, I believe, is an excellent gateway to philosophy. This is the first, and I think the most significant strength of the philosophy of objectivism. It really gets people interested in thinking, especially young people who might not be willing to pick up just any philosophical treatise that is published by an academician, be that academician someone who lived several centuries ago, or a professor who is writing today. Really, the interest and the passion that Ayn Rand displayed toward ideas, and the recognition that she had of the relevance of ideas and sound thinking and reason and logic to everyday human life are phenomenal. And I believe these are takeaways that every person should assimilate into his or her approach toward the world. In terms of the actual content of the philosophy, a major strength is the way in which it integrates various concepts that have occurred in other thought systems before. Ayn Rand was once asked to describe objectivism while standing on one foot. And what she came up with was this. In metaphysics, objectivism stands for objective reality, objective truth. In epistemology, objectivism stands for the use of reason, the human faculty of reason being capable of comprehending and explaining the way the world works. In ethics, objectivism stands for rational egoism, or enlightened self-interest, with all things considered and with the long term considered and not just the short term. What is good for you is actually also what is best for other people as well. As long as everybody is acting rationally, there's no possible conflict of interest. The conflict of interest only arises when there's irrationality or short-sightedness or failure to grasp some essential component of the truth. And in politics, Ayn Rand advocated free markets, the liberation of the human mind and the human productive ability to compete, to innovate, to produce, without the sorts of barriers that are often placed on innovation, without force being initiated against producers of value. So I think all of these are excellent concepts, and fundamentally they have my full agreement, and they have certainly appeared in other forms with other thinkers. The idea of an objective reality can be seen as early as the writings of Aristotle. The idea of reason in epistemology was one that drove the Enlightenment. the idea of enlightened self-interest also manifested itself in the writings of certain Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire. The idea of free markets, the ideas of individual rights, animated the writings of John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, and economists like Frederic Bastiat, Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek. And certainly what we see is all of these writers focusing on certain aspects of this integration of ideas. But Ayn Rand did a remarkable job in presenting them all as a single structure, a kind of skeletal framework upon which I believe it is essential to continue adding elaborations and further extrapolations in the ongoing search for truth. Another very important strength of objectivism is its powerful expression. Ayn Rand thought of herself as a novelist first, and then as a philosopher, and she only really saw the need to write philosophical nonfiction in order to extend and elaborate upon the ideas that she presented in her novels. Novels such as Anthem, We the Living, The Fountainhead, and Atlas Shrugged. And whatever one thinks of particular elements of those novels, one cannot deny that Ayn Rand's literary style is tremendously gripping and powerful. This is one of the most popular philosophical writers of all time. There have been surveys which essentially placed Atlas Shrugged as second in terms of reader popularity after the Bible, and the Bible has had many thousands of years in order to acquire this sort of popularity, whereas Atlas Shrugged was only published in the late 1950s. And furthermore, a lot of the particular elements of the philosophy of objectivism are quite admirable. There is tremendous respect for productivity and for the human mind. The central premise of Atlas Shrugged is, what would happen if the people of extraordinary ability, the people of the mind, went on strike and just refused to put forth the voluntary efforts of their minds that have essentially advanced human civilization throughout history? What would happen? Societies would collapse. And indeed, this insistence that there is objective truth, there is an absolute reality, that it can be discoverable by human beings exerting rational effort, and that there's a right way to approach this and a wrong way to approach this. It's very refreshing. It's refreshing because it provides a fundamental guidance. Philosophy doesn't so much provide particular answers to everyday problems, like how many hours a day should I exercise, or what should I eat for lunch tomorrow, or should I live in area X or area Y? But it does provide a kind of underlying framework, a way of thinking, a methodology that enables individuals to consider these kinds of decisions systematically. And objectivism is quite unwavering in this, which really helps people who take ideas seriously and reinforces a desire to find solutions, as opposed to existing in a kind of numbing intellectual fog. So with regard to the strengths of objectivism, there are many. And there would have been a time where I would have called myself an objectivist hands down. Now I have to qualify this, because there are shortcomings, in my view, to objectivism, at least as it was presented by Ayn Rand, and as it continues to be presented by many of her self-styled followers. Currently, when I'm asked that question, I reply that I'm an objectivist in the broad sense, but not in the narrow sense. In the broad sense, in that I agree with the fundamental premises and the attitude toward life that the philosophy of objectivism entails. but not in the narrow sense, because I do not believe that this binds me to accept any particular philosophical position that Ayn Rand or any one of her followers would espouse. And also, not in the narrow sense, in terms of the fact that I don't accept many of the frankly personal and stylistic idiosyncrasies that characterized Ayn Rand herself and the objectivist movement. I will not go into the particular idiosyncrasies here, but I would encourage anyone who is interested to read an excellent new biography of Ayn Rand by Anne C. Heller called Ayn Rand and the World She Made. So what are the more general weaknesses of the philosophy of objectivism? One weakness that I have observed in studying the history of objectivism from its early beginnings to the present is a tendency toward dogmatism, insularity, and intolerance. The willingness to ostracize anyone who dissents from the philosophy, either fundamentally or in any peripheral statement on which Ayn Rand or Leonard Peikoff, her intellectual heir, so-called intellectual heir, or other prominent objectivists have espoused in any length. So, for instance, anyone who questions to any degree a position that Ayn Rand had on abortion or intellectual property could be ostracized as not a true objectivist. And even if they say they're not an objectivist or don't consider themselves an objectivist, they could still be ostracized for being a, quote, evader, someone who has allegedly been presented with the truth but still refuses to accept it. I don't accept this characterization of dissenters as evaders. I do not think it is fruitful. I do not think it makes for productive intellectual discourse. I do not think it advances the search for truth. Because to characterize someone as an evader assumes that this other individual has a perfect glimpse into the mind of the person doing the characterizing, that this individual has had the same background, the same intellectual build-up to the particular conversation. Even if you're right and the other side is wrong, characterizing the other side as an evader presumes that you can just get away with briefly stating, oh, this is the truth, and everyone is supposed to intellectually bow down to you and accept it. Well, if this were the way the world worked, then while it would certainly be a much better world, there would be fewer errors and fallacies and atrocities that sometimes stem from errors and fallacies. Where in human history has that ever happened? It's important to be realistic in spreading true ideas and rational ideas. It's important to understand that even if you make the best possible case, or what you think is the best possible case, a well-meaning, intelligent person may still have reservations and may still want further evidence or may still disagree based on that person's unique set of experiences and concerns. And in order to really get across to that person, taking a confrontational or a condemnatory stance isn't going to help matters one bit. In order to get across to that person, one needs to genuinely understand where that person is coming from. And until one actually understands that person's background and assumptions, one cannot persuade that person. One can only alienate that person by characterizing them as evasive or evil. And to be sure, there are evil people in the world. There are mass murderers, there are terrorists, there are bigoted, intolerant fanatics. But chances are, if someone is willing to have a civil intellectual discussion with you, that person is not such a one. I think, in that sense, though this is not a formal principle of objectivism, many objectivists fail to grasp the distinction between statements and ideas that can be true or false, actions that can be right or wrong, and persons that can be good or evil. They make the leap between an idea being false and the espouser of that idea being evil, which I believe is something that needs to be combated vigorously if objectivism is to have greater prominence and if the search for truth is to have greater prominence. Now, I want to say that this is not a tendency of all people who call themselves objectivists, because this is really quite a diverse set of people. On the one hand, we do have dogmatically intolerant individuals who believe that every word that Ayn Rand ever wrote must be accepted in order for one to consider oneself an objectivist, people like her self-styled intellectual heir Leonard Peikoff. On the other hand, we have individuals like David Kelly, who considers himself an open objectivist and who believes that an objectivist thinker must be a thinker first and an objectivist second. Very admirable mentality, one that recognizes that ideological systems evolve. They assimilate new ideas over time. They work out existing ideas simply by the fact that no one thinker can ever write about everything, so other thinkers have to come in and fill the gaps or maybe correct the errors in what that first thinker wrote about. So there is hope in a more open, more tolerant objectivist approach, and perhaps the recent surge in popularity in Ayn Rand's works after the recent recession, as well as in the wake of the release of the Atlas Shrugged movie, could draw more people to the philosophy that are not as interested in adhering to every word that Ayn Rand wrote, but are interested in the search for truth and the extrapolation of the general principles that she so articulately laid out. Now, one unfortunate characteristic of the objectivist movement during the past 50 years has been a lack of internal intellectual momentum. With a few exceptions, there has been scant attempt to elaborate upon the philosophy, to extend it in new directions, to integrate it with the works of other thinkers. Recently, there's been an effort to change that, and one individual whom I would like to particularly point out as spearheading that effort is Professor Edward W. Younkins. Professor Younkins has published numerous anthologies which attempt to take various scholars' views of Ayn Rand's work and related endeavors, the growth of the libertarian movement, the works of the Austrian economists such as Mises, Hayek, Murray Rothbard, the works of Aristotle, the works of classical liberal thinkers, and build bridges to understand the interrelationships among those ideas, the various ways in which they influence one another, and the various ways that they can be elaborated upon for an even more comprehensive and rich and beautiful way of approaching philosophy and approaching life in general. This is the kind of intellectual momentum that needs to be cultivated, because if Ayn Rand is right, and there is one reality, we all inhabit one reality, and in this reality, every intellectual endeavor, every idea, is related to every other idea. There is a logic to the world that we can discover. There is an absolute truth that we can pursue in various ways depending on our individual skills and the areas in which we choose to specialize. Then it follows that we should make these connections more and more often. We should not just content ourselves with what Ayn Rand wrote or with what any one person wrote. Now, another obstacle to overcome, a weakness of objectivism as it has been historically and is now in some quarters, is a kind of particularism. Once again, there is a behavioral tendency, I think in part sparked by Ayn Rand's own very insistent personality. And I'm trying to be as diplomatic as possible, but once again, I encourage you to read Anne Heller's biography to get a better understanding of what I actually mean by that. So this personality is very oriented on particularism, on particular items in one's life symbolizing something supposedly broader, and if one does not adhere to these particular norms or behaviors or preferences, then one is somehow implicitly rejecting that broader symbolism. An excellent parody of that is a short play by Murray Rothbard titled Mozart Was a Red, that I encourage you to read. Now, this is a satire, and it's somewhat disparaging of Ayn Rand and her historical close circle of followers, but it does have some historical basis in it. And while I would, as always, counsel using reason and using active evaluation of anything one reads, I think reading this play is instructive as to pitfalls that should be avoided. Now, it seems to me that objectivism can be benefited via an integration and an exploration of other modes of thought, other philosophies, and other intellectual disciplines. And there's some of this to which objectivism is already fundamentally receptive, as, for example, an integration with economics. Ayn Rand strongly endorsed the work of Ludwig von Mises, even though she would not have agreed with his methodological subjectivism or his utilitarianism. Nonetheless, she considered him to be one of the best economists alive during her time. And I think it's important to look at the works of Austrian economists as studying human action and studying the implications of policies and generally the way human societies evolve and interact internally among their constituent individuals. It's important because while it's not a normative system, it is a system of considerable explanatory power. It actually tells us, for instance, what will happen if, all other things being equal, a politician raises the minimum wage. Well, all other things being equal, there will be a rise in unemployment. A lot of other intervening factors can come about, but if the rate of unemployment falls after the enactment of the minimum wage, we know that the decline is due to something else. It's not due to there being a higher minimum wage. Other philosophies with which objectivism can be integrated, or at least the relationships can be explored, are classical liberalism, the thoughts of Enlightenment philosophers, such as John Locke, Denis Diderot, François-Marie Arouet de Voltaire, and classical economists, Adam Smith, Frédéric Bastiat, David Ricardo. I would say none of these thinkers is right 100% of the time on 100% of the issues. But there is so much wisdom and there is so much beauty in what they have written that to miss all of that simply because one thinks that a particular philosophy has more truth in it would be regrettable. Another philosophy with which objectivism should be integrated is transhumanism, the desire to essentially transcend human bodily limitations, including limitations on our lifespan, through the use of technology and science. This is a new way of using reason to radically transform the human condition. And it has precedent throughout all of history. Throughout history, human life expectancy has risen dramatically, and there have been numerous technological interventions, including medical interventions, that have been responsible. On the other hand, many objectivists still believe that the finitude of life is somehow needed to give it closure, or that without death, life can have no meaning because one needs to be constantly making an affirmative choice between life and death. And to that I will say that if it really is the case, as the objectivist ethic states, that the fundamental choice of a human being is between life and death, and that it is a virtue to be consistent in making one's choices, as objectivism prides itself on logical consistency, then it is certainly consistent to choose life consistently over death, which means if death is unacceptable to me right now in my present state, then it would mean that death should be unacceptable to me always. And in particular, if science and technology are able to preserve my bodily integrity and my biological youth indefinitely, as scientists such as Aubrey de Grey and Ray Kurzweil predict will happen in the lifetimes of many who are alive today. This is, I think, a great way to make objectivism a cutting-edge philosophy, a philosophy that not only attempts to interpret or rationalize the way things currently are, or accept the current order or disorder, in fact, of the world as somehow natural and normal and good, but rather a philosophy that attempts to break out of those limitations. In many ways, objectivism already tries to do that in its radical insistence on individual freedom and on productivity and the use of the mind, and on its rejection of conformity and complacency and collectivism in favor of individualism, individual rights, and technological progress, at least within the scope that most objectivists today analyze it. If we break out of the more fundamental limitations of human involuntary mortality, it does not eliminate the fact that we have chosen to do so, that we still affirmatively choose life over death. I do not think the necessity for that affirmative choice at some level, however remote to our everyday experience, will ever go away, because these interventions to achieve indefinite human life will be deliberate and technology-driven, and driven by human logic and reason and their continual application. And one other group of people who could really improve objectivism are innovative objectivists. Individuals who don't care so much about strict adherence to everything that Ayn Rand wrote, but care more about the relevance of her ideas to their individual lives and individual contexts, and the ways in which her ideas can interact with the ideas of others in order to perpetuate the search for truth. Once again, in the words of David Kelly, an objectivist thinker must be a thinker first and an objectivist second. Thank you very much. I hope that this has laid out my position with regard to objectivism, both in its strengths and in its weaknesses, as well as outlined possibilities for improvement and reasons to be hopeful with regard to the future of this philosophy.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are going to address yet another argument which somewhat indirectly has been leveled against the proponents of eternal human longevity. And this argument, I think, really needs to be challenged because it comes from Ayn Rand. And Ayn Rand, in general, is a philosopher who has a lot of rational ideas. I agree with most of the fundamental principles that Ayn Rand advocates. However, in some of her particular reasoning, at least if that reasoning is applied to the wrong context, she can be off target, and she can be off target in such a way as to retard further progress. Now, the argument that is often leveled is that achieving indefinite human longevity would turn human beings into Ayn Rand's description of the immortal, indestructible robot. On page 15 of The Virtue of Selfishness, Ayn Rand writes, "To make this point fully clear, try to imagine an immortal, indestructible robot, an entity which moves and acts, but which cannot be affected by anything, which cannot be changed in any respect, which cannot be damaged, injured, or destroyed. Such an entity would not be able to have any values. It would have nothing to gain or to lose. It could not regard anything as for or against it. as serving or threatening its welfare, as fulfilling or frustrating its interests. It could have no interests and no goals. Now, with regard to that passage, there are several things that could be said in relation to prolonging human life indefinitely and lifting the death sentence that hangs over all of us. Now, the first thing that can be said is at no point in time will human beings become the immortal, indestructible robots that Ayn Rand describes. And the very simple reason for this is that our existence is physical, and it is contingent on certain physical prerequisites being fulfilled. Now, the moment one of these physical prerequisites is not fulfilled, our existence ceases. And this will always be the case, even if we no longer have a necessary upper limit on our lifespans. For example, people who attempt to live longer, people who succeed in that attempt by successfully combating senescence, could still get run over by a car. They could still experience a plane crash. And certainly, if it is ever the case that death by senescence and death by the myriad of diseases which kill many human beings today can be averted, then human beings will try to avert the other possibilities of death, say by developing safer modes of transportation, or by engaging in fewer wars, so that they do not stand the risk of being killed, as frequently at least. So it's possible to reduce the likelihood that one can be destroyed, but the possibility is always there. And also, because human beings have free will, they always have at least the option of choosing to undermine the physical prerequisites of their own lives. Now, I don't believe that any sane, rational human being would actually choose to pursue that option, but that option is nonetheless there. If anybody wants to commit suicide by immediate means or by a steady, long-term deterioration of one's organism, there's virtually nothing in the world that could ever prevent that. So, even with indefinite longevity, human beings will not become immortal, indestructible robots that Ayn Rand describes. They will always be vulnerable to something. And when we manage to avoid one kind of peril, other kinds of perils might even become more pressing. Say, if we do manage to live for hundreds of thousands of years, all of a sudden we will be much more subject to the long-term geological fluctuations of the Earth's climate that are not very noticeable because we simply don't live long enough to experience massive changes. Say, the cycle of ice ages. One ice age occurs on average every 8,000 years. Human beings so far have not lived 8,000 years, so most of us don't really worry about what's going to happen when huge glaciers advance over the continents. But if we do live for that long, that will become a pressing problem for our own lifetimes. And likewise, the longer we live, the greater the likelihood that we'll experience some kind of global cataclysm, like, say, a major volcano or an asteroid hitting the Earth. And so human ingenuity, human resources will have to be devoted toward fighting that. And I believe that's a very good thing to happen, because if human beings didn't have very long lifespans, they would not have the long-term orientation necessary to devote resources toward combating these perils. But even if such an immortal, indestructible robot could exist, and that robot, in every other respect, was identical to human beings, somehow it had human biological processes, human ways of thinking, just made out of very, very strong materials that didn't deteriorate or that automatically renewed themselves, that could automatically repair any injury that accrued to the robot, I still don't believe that Ayn Rand is correct here. Because the fear of death is not the sole motivator for human actions. It is not the sole motivator by far. I would say, actually, most great things that human beings accomplish are a result of positive motivations, not negative motivations. And Ayn Rand, to a certain extent at least, acknowledged this when she said that achieving life is not the equivalent of avoiding death. At least in the short term, you don't have to do very much to avoid death. You just have to stay out of trouble. You could just sit there and eat, drink, make sure you're warm, sleep. You'll avoid death, but that's not a full life, according to Ayn Rand. Obviously, to have a full life, you need to avoid death. Survival is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And many thinkers in the objectivist school have extended this to mean that survival is not enough. For a full life, you also need flourishing. And I agree with that notion. I believe that there are other positive motivations. For example, the desire to see oneself create something, to see something originating from one's mind and become embodied in the physical reality. To take some kind of aesthetic pleasure from a particular object or activity does not require even a thought of death. Moreover, to appreciate certain kinds of patterns in existence that are present in art, in technology, and even in games does not require any thought of death. Many people play games, even if those games do not directly contribute anything to their survival. Now, I don't believe, however, that doing so is irrational. Rather, it's another creative way to channel the activities of the human mind. The human mind essentially creates its own field of endeavor, so to speak. It creates a rule system within which it operates. And by operating within that rule system, it exercises its full potential, whereas just by sitting there and only doing the things that are necessary absolutely to survive, it would have missed some essential part of its functioning. So, creating art, music, scientific discoveries does not rely on having to die in the future, and it doesn't even rely on the threat of death. I think the immortal, indestructible robot, of course, might not engage in precisely the same activities as we do. It would probably not have to worry about earning its next meal by working for somebody else. But it could still paint a painting, just because it likes to see its mental processes, which in this scenario would be very much like ours, have some kind of external consequence, some kind of embodiment in the external reality. I believe this is a vital component of flourishing. So, this fear of death and this avoidance of death, as Ayn Rand herself elsewhere admitted, is not the same as achieving life. There's more to life than that. And as a result, I think the immortal, indestructible robot argument fails on multiple counts.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked by a long-time viewer and reader of my works where, more precisely, I disagree with Ayn Rand in her views on war. Because while I do admire Ayn Rand greatly and subscribe to many aspects of her philosophy, and while I do consider myself an objectivist in a broad sense, though not in a narrow sense, war is one issue where I consider Ayn Rand to have been deadly wrong. And I mean that literally, because one of the deadliest activities in which human beings engage is warfare. And warfare is morally impermissible, in my view, precisely because as an individualist, I cannot condone the deaths of hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions of innocent civilians who have had nothing to do with the causes or the wrong conduct that brought about a war in the first place. Unfortunately, Ayn Rand's views on war do have some amount of influence today, particularly through the so-called orthodox objectivists and their organization, the Ayn Rand Institute, which has recently been trumpeting every instance of US overseas interventionism, including the most recent fiasco in Iraq, as well as trumpeting a US invasion of Iran for over a decade now. So Ayn Rand made some comments during her speeches at the Fort Hall Forum during the 1970s. And the Ayn Rand Institute has proudly placed excerpts from those speeches where Ayn Rand specifically deals with war on its website in order to, at least in their view, justify their own highly belligerent positions. Those are positions that go beyond even what the Bush administration held its prerogatives to be in Iraq. For instance, the Bush administration still thought itself to be restrained by the traditional just war theory. Well, Yaron Brook, the executive director of the Ayn Rand Institute, wrote a very lengthy treatise about why he thought just war theory was inappropriate and dangerous and destructive. And furthermore, as a role model, he recommended General William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea in 1864, where Sherman deliberately burned the homes of peaceful civilians in the American South as a way to sap the morale of the Confederate government and effectuate a quicker surrender. For me, as an individualist, as someone who detests the notion of collective guilt, the idea of Sherman's March to the Sea and the atrocities that were perpetrated there, including the murders of innocent civilians, is thoroughly repugnant. So what I would like to do today is go through those statements that Ayn Rand made and refute them point by point to show you that really her arguments on this particular issue do not hold up. And while Ayn Rand was a strong philosopher in terms of the fundamental ideas in her philosophy, she held many peripheral views, such as her views on war, that do not directly follow from her philosophy, and that a consistent view of principles such as individualism would actually suggest that the opposite is true. So let's begin. Ayn Rand was asked, what do you think about the killing of innocent people in war? And this is what she said. This is a major reason people should be concerned about the nature of their government. The majority in any country at war is often innocent. But if by neglect, ignorance, or helplessness they couldn't overthrow their bad government and establish a better one, then they must pay the price for the sins of their government, as we are all paying for the sins of ours. And if people put up with dictatorship, as some do in Soviet Russia and some did in Nazi Germany, they deserve what their government deserves. Our only concern should be who started the war. Once that's established, there's no need to consider the, quote, rights of that country because it has initiated the use of force and therefore stepped outside the principle of rights. Now, those were Ayn Rand's words directly, so I am accurately representing her position here, but I think it's completely false. And here are three reasons. First of all, people, including large masses of people, might want to overthrow a bad government, but do not have the means to do so and fear for their lives. This tyrannical government, as is typical of tyrannical governments, might wield overwhelming force. And indeed it has to in order to stay in power, because most people wouldn't have let it stay in power if the leaders had just asked, oh, do you want us to oppress you, please? No. The only reason why that tyrannical government is still in power is because it already uses enough force to suppress not just armed revolution by its people, but even the merest significant political dissent. So the people should not suffer for already being thoroughly oppressed. That just compounds the injustice. In Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, there was a brutal tyranny, and Saddam Hussein was an arbitrary, capricious, bloodthirsty dictator. There's no doubt about it. But were the Iraqi people any better off when the United States federal government imposed decade-long sanctions that are estimated to have contributed to the deaths of about 1 million Iraqi children and then bombed Iraq to essentially a pre-industrial situation where running water, electricity, sanitation were largely lacking and had to be rebuilt very poorly through infusions of billions of US taxpayer dollars. Is that just? Or is that just a further exacerbation of the injustice of Saddam Hussein's regime? My second point regarding what Ayn Rand said was her argument implies collective guilt and is thoroughly anti-individualistic. To take the principle of individualism consistently means that one must assign moral responsibility only to a person who is directly and actively perpetrating evil. The moral responsibility for evil belongs to its perpetrators and not its victims, not the people who are also suffering as a result of the tyranny of a particular evil regime. Countries do not initiate wars qua countries because there's no such thing as a collective agency. There's only individual agency. The leaders of those countries, the individuals within the governments of those countries who take active measures to initiate those wars, and to a certain extent, the members of the military, particularly the higher-ups within those countries who participate in those wars, are the only individuals who are responsible and the only individuals who deserve punishment. And to a certain extent, the more those individuals have little control over the initiation of that war and the waging of aggression, the less punishment they deserve. So a foot soldier who probably has been drafted by that tyrannical regime and who doesn't want to be on the battlefield, but if he doesn't fight, he will be shot by his own side. He should not be punished for the damage that is done in that war. His generals might be culpable, probably are. The politicians in that country are definitely culpable. But the principle of individualism requires a very fine discernment. The collective countrywide guilt that Ayn Rand posits in her remarks is the complete antithesis of individualism, and it has no place in a philosophy that champions egoism and rational selfishness and regard for each man and each human life as a value in and of him and itself. Third, Ayn Rand's argument ignores the fact that only proximate causation, or the so-called but-for rule, can legitimately be used to attribute responsibility. And this goes back to a long-standing legal principle within every free or semi-free country. The but-for rule says that it's only the immediate event that caused a particular harm, and the perpetrator of that event that can be held responsible for that harm. So let's say you are walking in a very disreputable part of town, and somebody trips you and causes you to fall on the sidewalk and injure yourself. That person cannot have the excuse of, oh, well, you put yourself in danger when you chose to walk in that very disreputable part of town. Because had you not chosen to go there, well, you wouldn't have fallen and injured yourself. No. If he hadn't been there to actively trip that victim, then the injury would not have occurred. So it is the last action that could have been avoided, but that brought about the harm, that is the action that's identified as being responsible for the harm. And the person who had a choice over whether or not to inflict that action is the guilty party. Nobody else is the guilty party. The doctrine of proximate causation is very important, and it's the only rational way of assessing guilt or innocence. Because if that idea were not true, if anything but the proximate cause of a particular harm could be held responsible, then any action could be traced back to and blamed on the acts of a previous generation, or even on the formation of the earth. Well, nobody could be held responsible for murdering anybody because, look, the earth was created some 4.6 billion years ago, and then evolution took hold, and lo and behold, human beings evolved imperfectly. Human beings did not evolve an innate capacity to suppress all urges toward murder and destruction. So a particular murderer killing a particular victim
Well, there can be no blame in that. That murderer was just acting out the consequences of imperfect human evolution. This is the kind of absurd, slippery slope that a lack of respect for the doctrine of proximate causation can lead to. Or, more closely to what some people might argue, a particular criminal's acts might be excused by reference to his poor upbringing, or to oppression by the broader society, be it his or somebody else's, or even by oppression from his government, if we are to make a closer parallel to the kind of argument that Ayn Rand is making. But surely most objectivists would be completely opposed to that kind of reasoning. They would say, no, the criminal has obvious moral responsibility for choosing to commit that crime. Well, I can make that same case with regard to the government of a particular country, say the United States, which has complete moral responsibility for choosing to bomb innocent civilians based on the calculus that they might get a few terrorists in those explosions. It is the same proximate causation, because they didn't have to engage in that kind of bombing. They could have done something that didn't have the effect of killing those innocent civilians. They could have sent a targeted assassination against those terrorists, a squad of people that wouldn't have hurt any innocent civilians. So I think Ayn Rand here makes numerous fallacies that neglect the very underlying principles of an egoist individualist philosophy. In 1976, Ayn Rand made further comments in response to a question at the Fort Hall Forum. The question was, assume the Soviet Union started a war of aggression. Assume also that within the Soviet Union there are individuals opposed to communism. How do you handle this conflict? Legitimate question. This is how Ayn Rand answered it. I'll pretend to take the question seriously because it's blatantly wrong. The question assumes that an individual inside a country should be made secure from the social system under which he lives, and that he accepts, willingly or unwillingly, because he hasn't left the country, and that others should respect his rights and succumb to aggression themselves. Now, this is a rehash of the old and tired, if you don't like it, then leave argument that completely ignores reality, because an individual can see a suboptimality, or even a gross suboptimality, in terms of the societal and political and economic system under which he lives, but there's too much at stake for him at this point to just pack up and leave. Most people own sizable amounts of property that they wouldn't be able to take with them. Most people have family members that wouldn't be able to just get up and leave, even if that individual could. Furthermore, it may be very difficult to leave. One would need to travel large distances. It could be expensive and even dangerous, particularly if that country doesn't allow leaving and will stop you with armed guards at the border and possible criminal penalties, if not execution, if you try to leave. So it's not like there's this perfect world in which an individual can perfectly actualize the ideal situation in which he would like to live, and it's just a question of leaving a suboptimal situation. And furthermore, where would he go when everywhere in the world there's some measure of unfreedom to a greater extent or a lesser extent, and a particular individual may actually be better suited in trying to reform the injustice of the particular system under which he lives than to go somewhere else where he is not as well versed in the possibilities for reform. Now, that's not to say that nobody can leave, or that it's not practical or desirable to leave in any particular circumstance. But to say that one is morally culpable if one hasn't already left is ridiculous. Maybe it is practical and desirable for one to leave, and maybe one is trying, but one hasn't succeeded yet, and lo and behold, a purportedly freer country initiates a war and bombs that particular individual's home and kills him before he has a chance to leave. Is that fair? Is that just? Ayn Rand doesn't consider that time element in it, or the worthwhile nature of the attempts to leave that some of her contemporaries in the Soviet Union might have had. So this is, I think, a completely unjustified line of reasoning. But let's see what she says further. She says, "This is the position of the goddamned pacifists," her words, not mine, "who won't fight, even if attacked, because they might kill innocent people. If this were correct, nobody would have to be concerned about his country's political system. But we must care about the right social system because our lives depend on it. Because a political system, good or bad, is established in our name, and we bear the responsibility for it." Well, whatever name politicians use to legitimize their authority does not make it so. I mean, there is such a regime right now called the People's Republic of China. There is such a regime now called the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is neither democratic nor a republic nor an actual Congo. It's Zaire. There's also a regime called the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, which is, of course, the North Korean regime now ruled by Kim Jong-un. Not at all remotely related to anything that people would actually want. These are regimes that terrorize their people into submission. And furthermore, being concerned about one's political system does not in any manner equate to a guarantee of success in actually reforming it. If it did, then in this very country, the concern of millions of people who are liberty-minded about the political situation would have already turned it into a country where liberty is consistently respected. And while we do not yet, thankfully, live in a dictatorship or a kind of totalitarian tyranny that quashes all dissent, we are very far from a reasonably, decently free society. So what Rand is saying here is just because people were not successful in actualizing their concerns means that they might be deserving of death. So it's like, well, sure, you might want a better life, you might want a better world, you might have even tried to take some measures at great risk to your person to achieve it, but you haven't achieved it yet. So it's justifiable for another country to come in and kill you with a bomb or as part of a shootout where you happen to be caught in a crossfire, just because you haven't been sufficiently successful in unseating that oppressive regime. And that seems to me a terrible injustice and a terrible disrespect to the aspirations of people in every country who are liberty-minded and who do want change and who do want their oppressive regime to diminish in its oppressiveness and perhaps to end altogether, but they're facing some very real constraints in their attempts to do that. And furthermore, what about the children? Are they too complicit in, quote, passively permitting the oppressive regime under which they live? And when did they have time to do this? Is it when they were in the nursery or when they were in the womb? When could they have a chance to get up and rebel? Before they learn to talk, before they learn to read, before they genuinely know about what politics is or what freedom is? What about the elderly or infirm who might want to effectuate reforms but are physically unable to do so? They're too frail or they're too ill. This attribution of collective guilt flies in the face of individual human identity and the reality of these people's situations. Ayn Rand continued in what I find to be a very alarming statement. If we go to war with Russia, I hope the, quote, innocent are destroyed along with the guilty. There aren't many innocent people there. Those who do exist are not in the big cities, but mainly in concentration camps. Now, this was back in 1976. I was not alive then. My parents were alive then, and they were alive in the Soviet Union, and their parents and their grandparents were alive. And I know for a fact, from having met these people extensively, most people there were not guilty in any sense. They were innocent victims who had many of the same human characteristics, the same ambitions, the same skills, the same desires, the same emotions as anybody else in the world. And they tried to do their best in suboptimal circumstances, as most people who are decent do. It's unconscionable that Rand would have said this when she herself still had relatives living in the Soviet Union. And while I can't look inside her mind, perhaps it was an attempt to distance herself from their humanity, to make her separation from them feel less intense or less affecting, or to express some resentments that she had against them. I don't know. I can't draw a definitive conclusion. But it did seem to be motivated emotionally. And it has no place in civilized discourse to say that one would hope for innocent people to be eliminated in that way. Civilized discourse that I would disagree with could include a claim that, well, it's regrettable that innocent people die, but that's collateral damage, that's the nature of war, some greater good might justify it. Now, I think that's completely wrong, but it is, I think, an acceptable argument in civilized society. But this is just bloodthirst, in my view, and as much as I respect Ayn Rand, I have to say this, because I do not condone it. From a moral perspective, this is the exact opposite of what a civilized person ought to be thinking and ought to be saying, irrespective of what that person's position on the morality or desirability of war is. Ayn Rand continues by saying, nobody has to put up with aggression and surrender his right of self-defense for fear of hurting someone else, guilty or innocent. When someone comes at you with a gun, if you have an ounce of self-esteem, you answer with force, never mind who he is or who's standing behind him. If he's out to destroy you, you owe it to your own life to defend yourself. And my answer to this is there's always another way. If there's this one-on-one confrontation and you're an innocent person who is being threatened by an assailant, it may be possible to lure the assailant elsewhere and shoot him or escape him where there wouldn't be bystander casualties. And of course, every individual circumstance is different. But Ayn Rand had an excellent essay on the ethics of emergencies, where she specifically dismissed these kinds of lifeboat instant decision scenarios, precisely because they're not reflective of reality, and they're not what ethics is all about. Ethics is about the principles that animate day-to-day life. In such a situation where reasoned reflection and consideration of all the alternatives is possible. And sure, if you are in the heat of the moment, you're facing an assailant, you want to live, it's very difficult to react in an exactly desirable, optimal manner. You do essentially what is quickest in a manner that would save your life. And sometimes there may be unfortunate consequences, unintended consequences to that. But still, in many of these circumstances, there's another way. And this situation is not really analogous to a war in any event, because in a particular war, especially when the decision is made as to whether to go to war, whether to initiate the bombing of a particular city, say in the Dresden fire bombings of World War II, or the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which are, by the way, loudly endorsed by the Ayn Rand Institute. Those kinds of decisions are not act now or die situations. They do allow for extensive reflection and deliberation on the part of the officials who are making those decisions. And there is an inexhaustible variety of ways in which such a conflict might play out and either be escalated or de-escalated or even altogether prevented, depending on the actions and the decisions of individuals who hold responsibility for a large number of lives on their shoulders. So it's not appropriate to compare this to a mugging on the street. It's not a reflexive kind of response that is merited. Rather, it's precisely a very thoughtful response. A response that picks out the optimal outcome, the outcome that minimizes the amount of damage to innocent civilians. And in this world, one does not have to achieve perfection and achieve complete success in order to be a completely ethical person. But one cannot succumb to injustice or try to legitimize or rationalize injustice, where injustice is the deliberate infliction of harm upon an innocent other, without being unethical. So one could say, for instance, there is a terrorist, somewhere, and this terrorist is known to have committed a criminal act. It may be possible to send a targeted mission to get rid of that particular terrorist, and with the best of intentions, just target that particular person. But someone happens to die, and it's a tragedy. I could see that being an ethically justifiable scenario. But in a war, that's ruled out of the question altogether, because a country enters a war with its leaders knowing that civilians are going to die. And their calculus isn't, we're going to try to avoid all civilian deaths, but if there are any, well, that's very unfortunate. Their calculus is, there's a certain number of civilian deaths that, while unfortunate, we're going to have to accept right up front in order to wage this war. And because all wars lead to this, is precisely why I, as an individualist, and as someone who believes that one ought to, at least in the attempt, be ethical and not deliberately condone injustice. This is why I find war to be unacceptable. In 1977, Ayn Rand further discussed this issue at the Fort Hall Forum. She was asked, can you defend one country attacking another? And her response was, the source of this kind of statement is the idea that nations do not exist, only individuals, and if some poor, non-communist blob in Soviet Russia doesn't want an invasion, we mustn't hurt him. First of all, a very emotionally loaded kind of response, and a very derisive response to characterize people who were yearning for freedom in an unfree society, which in itself was a tremendously courageous kind of position to take. So she continues, but who permits governments to go to war? Only a government can put a country into war, and the citizens of that country keep their government in power. This is true in the worst dictatorships. Even the citizens of Soviet Russia, who did not elect the communists, keep them in power through passivity. Nazi Germany did elect its dictatorship, and therefore, even those Germans who were against Hitler were responsible for that kind of government and had to suffer the consequences. So my answer to this is, it's not as if the citizens of Soviet Russia could do much against a highly organized and ruthless Communist Party and Red Army apparatus. And it's not as if the citizens of Nazi Germany could do much against a highly organized and ruthless Wehrmacht and SS apparatus. If they tried, as many of them actually did, they would just find themselves in a grave before they would otherwise have been. There was a student group in Germany during the Second World War called the White Rose, led by the now famous Hans and Sophie Scholl. And these were very conscientious individuals who found the Nazi regime to be unacceptable. So they simply expressed their dissent peacefully. They broadcast leaflets opposing the war and opposing Hitler's regime. And they were discovered, they were tried, publicly humiliated, and executed. And they did not hasten the end of the war. Rather, they just essentially sacrificed their own lives, because while they were good people, and they were very well-intentioned people, they were no match for the brute force of that regime. And this is one thing about the world, one aspect of it that Ayn Rand failed to recognize, and that is that justice and reason and virtue in the world do not always have might on their side. And when the forces of oppression and destruction and evil have more might on their side, they will simply overwhelm the forces of virtue and reason. And so sometimes the forces of virtue and reason have to play a kind of covert game. They have to bide their time and wait for an opportunity to resist the oppression in such a manner as to minimize the harm to themselves and hope to bring about a better day where being rational and virtuous and just can actually lead one to flourish, as opposed to be executed or bombed or shot and lose all chances at a further opportunity for flourishing. So the choices for most of these people were to acquiesce, flee, or be killed. And fleeing was not always safe either. And while Ayn Rand managed it, many others were blocked or died trying. So it's a tremendous risk. And for people who either took that risk and failed, or decided that it was too much of a risk, that they would rather bide their time and try to reform the system from within, however covertly, or just outlive the system and try their chances in its aftermath. To condemn those people, to judge those people to be guilty of death is thoroughly unjust and anti-individualistic and neglectful of reality and the constraints that reality imposes on people. Ayn Rand continues by saying, individual citizens in a country that goes to war are responsible for that war. This is why they should be interested in politics and careful about not having the wrong kind of government. If, in this context, one could make a distinction between the actions of a government and the actions of individual citizens, why would we need politics at all? Well, first of all, a government is not a perfect reflection of the will of its citizens or a mirror image of what they desire. This is why even in countries where purportedly the government is based on the consent of the people and the will of the people, we have fraud in elections. We even have instances of very dubious electoral practices, to say the very least, in the primary elections in the United States. So it's not like the governments give the people precisely what they want. It's not like the very few people at the top actually care about what the overwhelming mass of ordinary individuals would desire or what would be best for them. No, quite the contrary. Ayn Rand continues, all governments would be on one side in this situation, doing something among themselves, while we private citizens would go along in happy, idyllic tribalism. But that picture is false. We are responsible for the government we have, and that is why it is important to take the science of politics very seriously. If we become a dictatorship and a freer country attacks us, it would be their right. And while I agree that it's important to take politics very seriously, and this is a threat that we all, irrespective of where we live, might become the unwitting and unwilling subjects of a very oppressive government that engages in aggression against its own citizens as well as people abroad. So we would want to prevent that, and we would want to, in whatever way we can, contribute to the establishment and continuation of a just system of government that respects individual rights, that respects peace, and the opportunities that individuals ought to have to flourish through their own productivity and the use of their own minds. However, the politics of oppressive governments, governments that don't meet that ideal, are such that all people, foreign and domestic, are their victims. And it is not tribalism, but rather individualism, to state that all individuals of reason and conscience should find sympathy for other individuals who share these values, no matter where they live or to what constraints they are subject. Only by expanding what Adam Smith called the circles of sympathy through commerce and cultural exchange can people undermine the possibility of international aggression. A great example today is there is virtually zero likelihood that the United States and China would go to war, even though they do have many geopolitical tensions and their regimes certainly have opposing perspectives in many areas. However, because the United States and China are so tied in trade, if either country were to initiate aggression against the other, it would be crippling itself. Frédéric Bastiat, the great 19th century French classical economist, said, if goods do not cross borders, armies will. So, commerce and peaceful interactions with people from other countries are the surest way to prevent aggression and to soften some of the deleterious aspects of any oppressive regimes that might exist in those countries. But to instead call for war, or to embrace war, is the most counterproductive advocacy imaginable. War destroys those very opportunities for economic and cultural exchange, and prevents the process by which the goods and values of freer countries undermine the regimes of less free ones. As an excellent example, what if around the time that Ayn Rand was making these comments in the mid to late 1970s, the United States decided to go to war against China? Ayn Rand would have thought, well, it's justified because China is an oppressive communist tyranny led at the time by Mao Zedong, and the people there deserve to suffer because of what Mao was doing to them. Well, it's very fortunate that the United States government decided not to engage in war against China, because what happened in China was a gradual and certainly incomplete liberalization, but a tremendous improvement over what existed there during Mao's era. And this is precisely because China and the West engaged in commerce. And with commerce came opportunities to share culture, and for the Chinese people to understand that Maoism is not the way, that it does not offer hope for a bright future, irrespective of how Mao might have indoctrinated them in the past. Instead, it results in misery and suffering, and right now, even the Chinese leadership is trying to downplay the significance of Mao as a kind of embarrassing moment in Chinese history. And sure, these improvements do not happen instantaneously. They still haven't taken their full course or anywhere near it in China. But if we're talking about actual human lives, and what is best for actual human beings, bombing them to death is not an avenue that is conducive to human flourishing. If we want a world that actually embodies the principles of objectivism, and not one that is vindictively destroyed because people in many places fall short of those principles, then we need a very thoughtful and measured and deliberate and peaceful approach toward bringing those improvements about. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope I have convinced you that individualism and rational egoism are not compatible with war or with justifying the deaths of innocent civilians.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Zoltan Istvan's new novel, The Transhumanist Wager, has been compared to Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. But to what extent are the books alike, and in what respects? To be sure, the story and the writing style are gripping, the characters are vivid, and the universe created by Istvan gave me an experience highly reminiscent of my reading of Atlas Shrugged more than a decade ago. Even this alone allows me to highly recommend The Transhumanist Wager as a work of literary art, a philosophical thriller. Moreover, the didactic purpose of the novel, its interplay of clearly identified good and evil forces, and its culmination in an extensive speech where the protagonist elaborates on his philosophical principles, as well as its punctuation by multiple smaller speeches throughout, provide clear parallels to Atlas Shrugged. Giulio Prisco calls the philosophy of the Transhumanist Wager's protagonist, Jethro Knights, quote, an extreme militant version of the radically libertarian formulation of transhumanism. However, this is the area where I perceive the most significant departure from the parallels to Atlas Shrugged. Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism, which she did not like to be called libertarian, though it was in essence, has the principle of individual rights and the rejection of the initiation of force at its ethical core. Galt's Gulch in Atlas Shrugged was formed by a withdrawal of the great thinkers and creators from the world of those who exploited and enslaved them. However, there was no active conquest of that world by Rand's heroes. Rather, without the men of the mind, the power structures of the world simply fell apart on their own accord. Jethro Knights creates his own seasteading nation, Transhumania, a fascinating haven for innovation and a refuge for transhumanist scientists oppressed by their governments and targeted by religious fundamentalist terrorism. The concept of an autonomous bastion of innovation is timely and promising. It was echoed by the recent statements from Larry Page of Google in favor of setting aside a part of the world to allow for unbridled experimentation. Transhumania, due to its technological superiority, spectacularly beats back a hostile invasion by the combined navies of the world. It is when the transhumanians go on the offensive that the parallels to Galt's Gulch cease. Instead of letting the non-transhumanist world crumble or embrace transhumanism on its own accord, Jethro Knights conquers it, destroys all of its political, religious, and cultural centerpieces, and establishes a worldwide dictatorship, including some highly non-libertarian elements, such as compulsory education, restrictions on reproduction, and an espousal of the view that even some human beings who have not initiated force may not have an inviolate right to their lives, but are rather judged on their, quote, usefulness, however defined, and perhaps, in the case of transhumania, usefulness in advancing the transhumanist vision as understood by Jethro Knights. Jethro Knights permits a certain degree of freedom, enough to sustain technological progress, high standards of living, and due process in the resolution of everyday disputes. But ultimately, all of the liberties in transhumania are contingent on their compatibility with Jethro's own philosophy. They are not recognized as absolute rights, even for those who disagree. John Galt would have been gentler. He would have simply withdrawn his support from those who would not deal with him as honest creators of value, but he would have left them to their own devices otherwise, unless they initiated force against him and against other rational creators of value. The outcome of the transhumanist wager is complicated by the fact that Jethro's militancy is the direct response to the horrific acts of terrorism committed by religious fundamentalists at the behest of Reverend Belinas, who also has considerable behind-the-scenes influence on the US government in the novel. Clearly, the anti-transhumanists were the initiators of force for the majority of the novel, and so long as they perpetrated acts of violence against pro-technology scientists and philosophers, they were valid targets for retaliation and neutralization, just like all terrorists and murderers are. For the majority of the book, I was without question on Jethro's side when it came to his practice, though not always his theory. But it was upon reading about the offensive phase of his war that I came to differ in both, especially since transhumania had the technological capacity to surgically eliminate only those who directly attacked it or masterminded such attacks, thereafter leaving the rest of the world powerless to destroy transhumania, but also free to come to recognize the merits of radical life extension and general technological progress on its own, in a less jarring, perhaps more gradual process. An alternative scenario to the novel's ending could have been a series of political upheavals in the old nations of the world, where the leaders who had targeted transhumanist scientists were recognized to be thoroughly wasteful and destructive, and were replaced by neutral or techno-progressive politicians who, partly for pragmatic reasons and partly arising out of their own attraction to technology, decided to trade with transhumania instead of waging war on it. Jethro's concept of the omnipotender is a vision of the individual seeking as much power as he can get, ultimately aiming to achieve power over the entire universe. It is not clear whether power in this vision means simply the ability to achieve one's objectives, or control in a hierarchical sense, which necessarily involves the subordination of other intelligent beings. I support power in the sense of taming of the wilderness and the empowerment of the self for the sake of life's betterment, but not in the sense of depriving others of a similar prerogative. Ayn Rand's vision of the proper, rationally egoistic outlook is extremely clear on the point that one must neither sacrifice oneself to others nor sacrifice others to oneself. Istvan's numerous critical references to altruism and collectivism clearly express his agreement with the first half of that maxim. But what about the second? Jethro's statements that he would be ready to sacrifice the lives of even those closest to him in order to achieve his transhumanist vision certainly suggest that the character of Jethro might not give others the same sphere of inviolate action that he would seek for himself. Of course, Jethro also dismisses, as a contrived hypothetical, the suggestion that such sacrifice would be necessary, at least in Jethro's view for the time being. And I agree. Yet, a more satisfying response would have been not that he is ready to make such a sacrifice, but that the sacrifice itself is absolutely not required. for individual advancement by the laws of reality, and therefore it is nonsensical to even acknowledge its possibility. Jethro gave his archenemy Belinus far too much of a philosophical concession by even picking sides in the false dichotomy between self-sacrifice to others and the subjugation of others to oneself. Perhaps the best way to view the transhumanist wager is as a cautionary tale of what might happen if the enemies of technological progress and radical life extension begin to forcefully clamp down on the scientists who try to make these breakthroughs happen. A climate of violence and terror, rather than civil discourse and an embrace of life-enhancing progress, will breed societal interactions that follow entirely different rules and produce entirely different incentives from those which allow a civilized society to smoothly function and advance. I hope that we, at least in the Western world, can avoid a scenario where those different rules and incentives take hold. I am a transhumanist, but I am also a humanist in the sense that I see the advancement of humanity and the improvement of the human condition as the desired aims of technological progress. In this sense, I am fond of the reference to the goal of transhumanists as the achievement of a humanity plus. Transhumanism is, and ought to be, fundamentally a continuation of the melioristic drive of the 18th century Enlightenment, ridding man of the limitations and terrible sufferings which have historically been considered a part of necessary so-called human nature, but which are in reality the outcome of the contingent material shortcomings with which our species happened to be burdened from its inception. Will it be possible to entice and persuade enough people to embrace the transhumanist vision voluntarily? I certainly hope so, since even a sizable minority of individuals would suffice to drive forward the technological advances which the rest of humanity would embrace for other non-philosophical reasons. In the absence of a full-fledged embrace of this humanistic vision of transhumanism, at the very least I hope that it would be possible to sneak around the common objections and restrictions and achieve a technological fait accompli through the dissemination of philosophically neutral tools such as the internet and mobile devices that enhance individual opportunities and alter the balance of power between individuals and institutions. In this possible future, some of the old cultural baggage, as Jethro would refer to it, would most likely remain, including religions, which are among the hardest cultural elements for people to give up. However, this so-called baggage itself would gradually evolve in its essential outlook and impact upon the world, much like Western Christianity today is far gentler than the Christianity of the 3rd, 11th, or 17th centuries. Perhaps instead of fighting transhumanism, some representatives of old cultural labels will attempt to preserve their own relevance amidst transhuman-oriented developments. This will require reinterpreting doctrines and will certainly engender fierce debate within many religions, as well as many political and societal circles. However, there may yet be hope that the progressive wings of each of these old institutions and ideologies, progressive in the sense of being open to progress, not to be mistaken for any current partisan affiliation, will do the equivalent work to that entailed in a transhumanist revolution, except in a gradual, peaceful, seamless manner. Yet on the other hand, the immense urgency of achieving life extension is without question a sentiment I strongly identify with. Jethro's experience early in the novel of stepping on a defective mine has autobiographical parallels to Istvan's own experience in Vietnam. A brush with death certainly highlights the fragility of life and the urgency of pursuing its continuation. Pausing to contemplate that were it not for a stroke of luck at some prior moment, one could be dead now, and all of the vivid and precious experiences one is having could one day be snuffed out with not even a memory remaining, certainly motivates one to think about what the most direct, the most effective means of averting such a horrific outcome would be. Will a gradual, humane, humanistic transition to a world of indefinite life extension work out in time for us? What can we do to make it happen sooner? Can we do it within the framework of the principles of libertarianism in addition to those of transhumanism? Which approaches are the most promising at present, and which, on the other hand, could be counterproductive? How do we attempt to enlist the help of the so-called mainstream world while avoiding or overcoming its opposition? For me, reading The Transhumanist Wager provided further impetus to keep asking these important, open, and as of yet unresolved questions, in the hopes that someday the ambition to achieve indefinite life extension in our lifetimes will give rise to a clear, ultra-effective strategy that can put this most precious of all goals in sight. Thank you very much. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. In my reviews of Part 1 and Part 2 of the Atlas Shrugged film trilogy, I expressed largely favorable reactions to those films' message and execution. Naturally, I was eager to see Part 3 and the completion of the long-awaited Atlas Shrugged trilogy. After I watched it, though, my response to this conclusion is more muted. The film fails to do full justice to the culmination of Ayn Rand's magnum opus, where one would expect to witness the coalescence into an integrated worldview of all of the philosophical and plot pieces that Rand meticulously introduced during the first two parts. Atlas Shrugged Part 3 is not without its merits, and it is inspiring in certain respects, especially in its conveyance of Rand's passionate defense of the creator individualist. However, the film is also not a great one, and the creators could have made Rand's source material shine consistently instead of glowing dimly while occasionally emitting a bright flicker. The first strength of this film is that there is now a complete film series, spanning the entire story arc of Atlas Shrugged. What Ayn Rand herself and many successive filmmakers could not achieve, producers Harman Kaslow and John Aglioloro have been able to bring into existence. For decades, admirers of Ayn Rand's work have lamented that no Atlas Shrugged movie had been made. The fact that this particular lament is obsolete constitutes major progress for objectivism, where the rate of progress is admittedly extremely slow. The first weakness of the film is that Part 3, in my view, is the most poorly executed of the three Atlas Shrugged movies, even though it had the potential to be the best. The extreme brevity of Part 3, a mere 90 minutes compared to 102 minutes for Part 1 and 112 minutes for Part 2, orphaned many of the events of the film from their contexts, as compared to the meticulous rationale for each of Ayn Rand's decisions in the novel. John Galt's speech, which received some 70 pages in the novel, had been cut to bare bones and lacks the deep, rigorous, philosophical exposition that Ayn Rand saw as the substance and culmination of the novel. The second strength of the film is that, as was the case with the previous installments, the film's creators conveyed a plausible sense that the events of Atlas Shrugged could happen in our own world, or at least in a world that greatly resembles ours as opposed to the world of 1957. In this sense, the film's creators succeeded in conveying the universality of Atlas Shrugged's moral message. The second weakness of the film is that changes in directors and the entire cast for every single one of the Atlas Shrugged films greatly detract from the continuity of the story, especially for viewers who may watch the films back to back once all of them are available on DVDs or on other media. The third strength of the film is that the reactions to Galt's speech by Ron Paul, Sean Hannity, and Glenn Beck added authenticity and relevance to the film, and reinforced the message that the conflict between value creators and so-called looters, that is, cronyists or purveyors of political pull, is very much present in our era. In addition, whether one agrees or disagrees with these notable figures, it was amusing to see them in a dramatization of Ayn Rand's literary world. The third weakness is that the film fails to do justice to many important plot elements in Part 3 of the book. Hank Rearden, my favorite character from the book, and the most compelling character in Part 2, barely makes an appearance. Cheryl Taggart's suicide is only expressed in retrospectives of her realizations that drove her to this desperate act, while she is not actually shown taking any steps toward it. The fate of Eddie Willers at the end of the film is almost completely unaddressed, with a mere intimation that the protagonists have another man in mind for whom they plan to stop, but no validation that this would indeed be Eddie Willers. The treatment of Eddie Willers in the novel is ambiguous. Ayn Rand leaves him beside a broken-down Taggart transcontinental train engine, abandoned by the railroad workers. He might be rescued, or he might perish, but he has not yet been invited into Galt's Gulch. The film creators neither pose the ambiguity nor attempt to resolve it. For me, the fate of Eddie Willers, a sincere, moral, hard-working man who respects the achievements of heroic individualists, but is not, according to Rand, one of them, is a key concern in Atlas Shrugged. I think Rand treated him with undeserving harshness, considering that people like Eddie Willers, especially if there are millions of them, can be tremendous contributors to human flourishing. The film creators missed an opportunity to vindicate Eddie and give him some more serious hope of finding a place in the new world created by the inhabitants of Galt's Gulch. In Galt's Gulch, the film shows Dagny Taggart explaining her plan to have a short railroad built to service Francisco d'Anconia's new copper mine. But who would actually physically build the railroad and do the job well, if not people like Eddie Willers? The fourth strength is that the film's narrator does a decent job at bridging the events of the previous two installments and the plot of Part 3. The events in the film begin with Dagny Taggart crash landing in Galt's Gulch, and even those who did not read the book or watch the preceding two films would be able to follow how and why she got there. The film is also excellent in displaying the corruption, incompetence, spitefulness, and callous scheming of the crony corporatist establishment that Rand despised and that we should despise today. The smoky backroom scene where the economic planners toast to the destruction of Minnesota is one of the film's high marks, a memorable illustration of what the mentality of sacrificing the parts for the whole actually looks like. The fourth weakness is that while moderately effective at conveying narratives of events, and generally decent in its treatment of ethics and politics, the film does not do justice to the ideas of metaphysics and epistemology, also featured prominently in Atlas Shrugged. Furthermore, the previous two films were generally superior in regard to showing, in addition to telling, the fruits of the creative efforts of rational individualists, as well as the consequences for a society that shackles these creators. In the Part 3 film, many of the scenes utilized to illustrate these effects seemed more peripheral than central to the book's message. Much of the footage hinted at the national and world events that take place in the book, but did not explicitly show them. Amid these strengths and weaknesses remains an opportunity to continue the discussion about the undoubtedly crucial implications of Ayn Rand's message to today's political and societal climate, where there looms the question of how much longer the creator individualists who power the motor of the world can keep moving forward in spite of the increasingly gargantuan obstacles placed in their way by legacy institutions. Any work that can pose these questions for consideration by wider numbers of people is welcome in an environment where far too many are distracted by the bread and circuses of mindless entertainment. Atlas Shrugged Part 3 is a film with intellectual substance and relevance, and so is worthy of a relatively short time commitment from anyone interested in Ayn Rand, objectivism, philosophy, and current events. However, those who watch the film should also be sure to read the novel, if they have not already done so, in order to experience much greater depth of both plot and philosophical ideas. Thank you very much.